Hello, everyone. Gary here. So I thought I'd take a look at Sinead O'Connor and highlight the themes, or some of the themes at least, of Saturn in Aquarius, because we're going to have Saturn return to Aquarius in January of 2023 and for the next couple of years, 2.5 years until 2025. So it's an important one. We're going to look at how this is played out in her life and some of the themes we might say in a general way. Saturn is very strong in Aquarius on the one hand, especially the first 20 degrees of the sign, which is called Mul Trikona or root strength. So it's particularly effective in that position. The last 10 degrees is not in this root strength, but it's still in its own sign. And it's moved into the lunar mansion that is associated with Jupiter. So it ties in Jupiter themes more so by the end of the sign, as opposed to the beginning of the sign, where and the middle of the sign more so, where it's definitely this sort of more innovative and ingenious. So this is the thing. You can't have Saturn in Aquarius and just think that it's just Saturn and Aquarius, not like Capricorn. And this is the one reason why things are going to progress in a big way from 2023 onwards, and how in Sinead O'Connor's chart, I'll show you why this kind of progressed in the way it did in her life. But just generally, Saturn in Aquarius is progress, it's innovation, it's building something new. And especially when it goes into that middle part in the lunar mansion associated with Rahu itself, which also co-rules Aquarius, we're going to see a lot of Rahu kind of themes come up. And Rahu really is like the alter ego of Saturn in many ways. So if Capricorn and Saturn is all about like structure and form and order and keeping things steady and stable and all of that, and following a tradition and sticking to the rules. Aquarius is not that, even though Saturn rules Aquarius because of Rahu. Because Rahu twists and turns everything and exaggerates everything and distorts everything and innovates everything and pushes things forward and constantly challenges us to move forward. So Saturn, i.e., the structures in our life, will be forced to move forward from 2023. Now, in Sinead O'Connor's chart, again, like I said, it's reached the end of the sign, so it's more associated with Jupiter, as well as Rahu. And we can see in her chart how both are playing a big role in this, and I'll show you that now. But really, what that means is in her chart, she really is more about challenging the status quo in terms of religion. I mean, that's been her, it's not been her only thing, but she's as famous for her outspoken views about the Catholic Church, for example, than she is for her voice, for her singing voice. She's as famous for becoming a priest, being ordained a priest in Ireland at one point, and then announcing the Catholic Church, and then converting to Islam. So she's as famous for those things, well, in Ireland at least, than as she is for her records. So this is Saturn in Aquarius. It really challenges. She is a challenger. She is a progressive thinker. She is all about Saturn in Aquarius. And you can see here in her chart that Saturn has reached the last degree of Aquarius in her chart. Now, regardless of the sign, when a planet has reached the last degree, the highest degree, for Rahu, it's in reverse. But for any planet that's reached the highest degree, regardless of sign, that is a really important planet. That is called in India the Atma Karaka. Atma is soul and Karaka significator. So the soul significator. So the planet that has reached the highest, regardless of the sign, has an important role to play in this life for the soul and the life's purpose of the person. So you might want to check yours. What planet has reached the highest degree in your chart? That planet has a big role to play. So for Sinead O'Connor, it's Saturn. Now, this is where the more, let's say, not so easy aspects of Saturn have come in, because taking on Saturn type of issues your whole life has been a challenge. So she has been this progressive thinker, this person who's challenged the status quo. She is very controversial in her comments and in her protests. Protest is another big part of Aquarius, of course. So we're going to see more and more and more of that in the years to come. But one of the things that's not been so easy for her, if we look at it from Scorpio, and it's the fourth sign, the fourth host sign, Aquarius, and that's the mother. And if you know anything about Sinead O'Connor's past, is her really challenging relationship with her mother, who basically abused her. So it's quite challenging to hear these stories. And I don't know why. Well, of course, we know why it is more especially challenging to hear about a mother beating her child and stomping on her stomach, and really horrific sort of stories of neglect and abuse by her mother, the person that's supposed to be there to care for her. That's fourth house. So Saturn in the fourth house in this case absolutely didn't care for her. And she was obviously affected by that in a big way. Her mental, emotional health has been a real challenge. And that's another thing that she's just as famous for, in fact, as her singing and as her protest songs, is her mental ill health. There are a lot of challenges in this chart if you want to pick it up, but I want to just focus more on Saturn and how Saturn's having an impact on her mental being, and it's challenging. First of all, Saturn in the fourth, not only is in the fourth, that's one thing, but it aspects the first, and it's got this 10th house aspect to the first when it's in the fourth. That's really why Saturn in the fourth is so challenging. It's not only impacting your mental well-being, your happiness, but it's also aspecting your first sign. So anyone with Scorpio rising obviously needs to be mindful of this in the coming few years, that Saturn's moving into the fourth house. And if you're not working at being happy, Saturn's probably going to be working on you. So it's really important that you do something productive and innovative, maybe even, and push things forward so that you're not stagnant. Saturn in the fourth in Aquarius is asking you, Scorpio, I'm referring to now specifically, to be more engaged with your mental well-being, your mental health and well-being. Now, it's not everyone who has the kind of lineup that she has because of, Scorpio rising with Mercury there also. It's an exact aspect to her Venus as well. Relationships have been impacted in a big way for her also, but also her sun is here, the 10th Lord, aspected by Saturn. So all of these planets come under Saturn's domain. So that's a whole other. The other thing to say is that Saturn in Aquarius, again, is co-ruled by Rahu, so you can't really take it on its own. And we're not going to be able to take Saturn in Aquarius like we did Saturn in Capricorn for the last few years. That's a good thing. That's a good thing because things are going to progress. But in another way, they're going to progress in ways that maybe we wouldn't always welcome. And that's Rahu. Rahu, again, is the alter ego of Saturn. So if Saturn is responsibility and commitment and due diligence, Rahu is like irresponsibility, really being chaotic and disorderly and disruptive. And again, Sinead O'Connor is that, and she's doing that as she's a protester. She's an anarchist, you might say. That's Rahu. But look at her chart. It's Rahu is in Aries. So now Saturn in Aquarius for the next few years, we need to look at what Rahu's doing. And it's the same setup in her chart as it is next year. Saturn has returned to Aquarius by January, and Rahu continues to transit through Aries till October. So it's a kind of similar configuration. Rahu has already moved over its natal position in her chart at 21 degrees, which just so happens to be this eclipse degree of November 8th. And interestingly enough, what we're seeing is the events that have happened in her life in the past, the really controversial one, the most controversial one, you might say, is when she tore up a picture of the Pope on live TV in the US. And that really was basically her downfall in terms of her career, which she apparently subsequently was very thankful for because she felt trapped in her career, which is another Saturn type of indication. And this Rahu breaking out of it in protest. Saturn in the fourth, remember, is powerful, but it's aspecting also the third sign from there, Rahu in Aries. And Rahu is all about breaking free from restraint. And Aries is the sign of war, of protest. And it's the sixth whole sign for Scorpio. So for her, she's definitely been this protester. This is where the eclipse is at 21 degrees. And now we're seeing this documentary being released in the cinemas. And basically, it's dredging all of this up again. It's highlighting all of these big themes of her life, this protest, and how actually, I think the beginning of the movie as well, I haven't seen it yet, but the beginning of the movie or documentary shows that incident. Or when she goes on stage a couple of weeks later, how she's booed off stage at a concert. And so it starts this whole discussion about, what she had said about the Catholic Church. And, you might say she was ahead of her time. Indeed, she was. Catholic Church didn't admit to any of the child abuse for years until years after she did that. So that's another thing of Rahu. It's about progress and it's about innovation, but it's also about being ahead of the game and seeing that kind of abuse. And again, that's all sixth house indication in her chart. And Mars ruling Rahu is an important one, not only the Saturn aspect to Rahu, but Mars's aspect. You can see here, you might be able to see it easier in the South Indian. Saturn aspects the third sign, and her sixth host sign, by the way, that's Aries. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. But Mars also aspects by eighth sign aspect onto Aries from its position in Virgo. So it's going to aspect the eighth sign onto Aries, where Rahu is. So Rahu is getting this hit from Saturn and Mars. So you know you're going to see a lot of challenge there in her wanting to break free from any kind of restraint, and being restrained as a pop star and having to, you know, do certain things a certain way, even though she never really seemed to do that. She never really seemed to be fitting a certain mold. Like she would shave her head from the beginning, and which is interesting that the fact that she started shaving her head really early on, because Aries is the head and Rahu is this kind of, again, this anarchist. You know, she just started shaving her head. She wasn't going to be the pop princess ever, right? But even so, even within that and her looking the way she wanted to look, she probably did have a lot of restraints on her in terms of what she could say and what she couldn't say, in terms of the songs she had to release because of the record companies and all of this. So that wouldn't sit well with someone like this who wanted to really break free. The other thing you might notice in your chart is that Jupiter is in Cancer. So you might think, oh, well, that's a really nice position. That's exalted Jupiter. Surely that's great, except it's retrograde. And so it behaves as if it's debilitated in Capricorn opposite. So it's actually in her Jupiter years, all of these Jupiter years in her 20s and into her 30s, late the 1990s mostly, that she became more vocal about her beliefs. And she was ordained a priest actually in Ireland at the time. And then she subsequently renounced that. Basically, she's changed her religion a lot. That's ninth sign, that's Jupiter. That's again another indication of this change. And Rahu, by the way, is involved. Rahu Ketu are involved with the moon, the ninth lord, in the 12th house. So you can see her changing her religion. Anytime Rahu influences the ninth house or ninth lord, you're going to see a change of religion or a change of belief systems in the person. She's changed her beliefs many times, and more recently, she's converted to Islam. So that's the Jupiter and the ninth lord involved in the nodes, and the Jupiter retrograde behaving like Rahu in many ways. Any retrograde planet really behaves like Rahu and Ketu because they're always retrograde. So Jupiter in the ninth house, you might think, first of all, that that's a great, strong position, and there is strength there, and she has a strong faith. Let's face it, she has spent a lot of her life thinking about these things, and one of her albums, I think, was called Theology. But the thing is as well that she's changed her faith so much, and that's challenged her, and she might have questioned her faith a lot. Well, obviously she would have, because that means she changed her faith. And that's Jupiter retrograde in Cancer, behaving as if it's in its debilitation. And interestingly enough, and I bring up the chart here, this is the day that she ripped up the picture of the Pope. And Saturn was in Capricorn at the time. And why is that important? Because Saturn in Capricorn is their third sign. I mean, literally ripping up a picture of a Pope with Saturn in your third house, that's again denouncing the Catholic Church and that kind of act of violence, third house. But of course, opposing then her Jupiter. That was one of the key things, right? So that's one indication for her. And remember, she was in a Jupiter cycle this whole time in the late 90s. It was Jupiter Mercury when she ripped up the picture. I think it was 1992. Yeah, Jupiter Mercury. So you can see Mercury playing a role in here as well. And there's an aspect from Jupiter onto Mercury, the 8th and 11th Lord in the first. So that's another challenging condition here, I guess you might say, about this chart, because the 8th Lord in the first is bringing these more difficult issues, I would say, into the person's life to have to deal with, to have to express as well. And again, she's expressing it through her songs and her singing, but it is a message that she's wanting to relay. So why the singing? That's another thing to look at, because you might think Mercury is about singing. It is about voice in terms of speech, but it's not necessarily about melody and singing. That's the moon. And then you look at the moon in her 12th house and you think, well, How's that tied in then to her career? Well, obviously, you don't look at this chart specifically for career. You can look at certain things, of course. You can look at the 10th house generally. You could say that about the sun in her first house, an important one, that she is a leader in her field in some way. But it's actually the moon is an important one to look at, and the 10th from the moon, especially in the natal chart. And what is the 10th from the moon when it's in Libra? It is the moon. 10th from Libra is Cancer. And so again, you're going to see not just the singing, that's an indication here of moon in Libra, 10th from moon Cancer, moon in Libra in the voice, but Jupiter is in the 10th from the moon, which is again this singing about something more meaningful. And she's getting it's about getting a message across. But then, of course, you want to look at the Navamsha and the Dashamsha, the D9 and D10 to see her career in those aspects as well. The D9 career, but also talents, skills she has. And what are you seeing? Of course, you're seeing the moon very prominent here, rising in this chart, along with Jupiter and Rahu. So that for me suggests that her role, her purpose in life is actually to sing, that's moon, but also to preach, that's Jupiter, and also to protest, that's Rahu. She's got all of it going on. Moon, Rahu, and Jupiter all rising in Libra. 10th from here again is the moon. So it's the voice, the singing, and Mercury's in the 10th. And then the D10, of course, it's important to look at the D10 and the 10th house here, as well as the 2nd and the 6th for career. 7th as well can be looked at for career when someone gets into business, 7th. But 10th in this case, again, same thing, moon. And the moon is rising again. So the 10th from the ascendant and the moon in the D10 is the moon. And again, it's Libra. And Libra is all about the arts. So, and also she's got Venus and Mercury combined anyway with the sun in her rising sign, which when you have Venus and Mercury combined, that's very much about the arts anyway. But again, it's more specifically the strength and position of moon in the D9 and D10 and in the Rashi, and the 10th from the moon being the moon. And again, the moon in each of those charts, the D1, the D9, and the D10, all in Libra. So basically, it's all about her voice. So that's Sinead O'Connor. She's used her voice, her beautiful voice, I think, in a way to protest, to get a message across. And she's ahead of her time. She's Rahu type, a character in that way, in terms of Rahu in the 6th. And it's just fascinating that Rahu has just come back here. The eclipse is happening here. And this documentary now is just being released, highlighting her role as a protester. And again, in a way, how we call Rahu tomorrow's people, that she's always been ahead of her time. So I hope you found that interesting. Just highlighting some themes about Saturn and Aquarius. Maybe just to wrap it up, I might just mention some general things about it moving forward. We are going to see, like I said, a lot of progress in the world, but we're also likely to see a lot of protest. So that's no surprise. We're going to see some technological advancements that do not always consider the repercussions. That's one of the downsides of Aquarius. There are many instances where Aquarius shows, and I can have chart after chart after chart that show this sort of innovation without consideration, without considering the consequences. Now, how will we place that in our current context? Well, I mean, you might think that that's the case for any sort of technological advancement. And let me just maybe leave it with one example. The last time Saturn was in Aquarius in the early 90s, 1994. If you think back to 1994, there was a lot going on back then. But basically, 1994 was the first smartphone. So I could point out lots of things. I'm writing an article about it at the moment, which I will highlight all the many themes of Saturn in Aquarius also. But why is smartphone? What's that all about? Well, of course, Saturn is about building new technologies. So we're going to see new technologies in the coming years, most likely. But what's the downside of that? Well, that's obvious. Smartphones connect us to each other in one way, but also disconnect us in another way. And that's the dichotomy of Aquarius. We have to always be on our guard for that. We have to be mindful of, we have this brand new technology and we think this is great, and it is great. But then there's also this downside to it. That's the Rahu side to it. And that's the side always, that we have to take with innovation. It's inevitable. So what are we going to see progress in 2023 to 2025. I mean, who knows what kind of technologies are going to come out, because it's kind of mind blowing what you can do now already. So we shall see. So, like I said, I have almost finished writing that article actually on Saturn in Aquarius, and I've titled it "Resist Resistance." So it's a bit of a tongue-in-cheek title, but what it basically means is Saturn in Aquarius. Saturn is where we might resist also, but Aquarius is all about resisting. So basically, i.e., in other words, changing. So resistance, and change, in other words. And it might not be easy, but we're all going to be asked to make some big changes in our lives in the coming few years. And there might be a lot of protesting it. We might personally protest it, even if we never said a word to anyone. We might protest the changes that are happening in our life, in this area of our life. But we must change. We absolutely must change. The two signs that are going to be very impacted by this, of course, well, a few signs, but Mars' signs certainly, Aries and Scorpio, because Saturn is aspecting these two signs. Capricorn and Aquarius are always impacted by Saturn, of course, but Aquarius more personally. So these signs, the Mars and Saturn signs, are going to be impacted. But the aspect also onto the opposite sign, Leo, the sun sign Leo, is going to be impacted. And that's why we're going to see more and more protests, because Saturn is opposite Leo, the leaders. Aquarius is always opposite the leaders, i.e., humanity always revolts against those who would lead them. This is always the case. I mean, what are you protesting against unless it was some power figure? You're protesting Aquarius, whether it's religious power figure in Leo, or whether it's the governments, or whatever it is, it's leaders of any kind. And you can see, of course, in Sinead O'Connor, another indication here of why this has been a big theme in her life as well, is that she has Saturn opposite Pluto in Leo. So that she has been very much about this inner struggle within herself that's been played out in her struggles in the world, and with these major big themes, and taking on other people's struggles as well, in many instances. So we're going to be doing a lot more of that in the coming years. We're going to see a lot more of that, even if we don't express that outwardly ourselves. We might internally express that protest against whatever changes are happening. But that's Aquarius. It's like it's the most unusual sign in a way, because it's the sign of change, but it's also a fixed sign. It's an air sign, so it's all about movement and progress and forward thinking. But again, it's a fixed sign. So how do you have a fixed air? Like how does that work? Well, basically, on the one side, it's this rigidity in thinking that this is the only way we can progress from here. That's one downside. But another way, it's this kind of thinking outside the box. And when you then discover something that comes like this bolt from the blue, you stick with that, and this is what we're going to do now. And and pushing it forward constantly means also sticking to your guns. Another kind of fixity that is in Aquarius is that we need to keep moving forward. And that, in a way, despite it being about moving forward, is in a way a rigidity. So we need to keep moving forward. We need to keep changing. Is a kind of rigidity when you think about it. So we're going to see a lot of these themes play out. Like I said, I'll have the article out for you soon. Saturn in Aquarius, resistance. So I hope you enjoyed that, and Sinead O'Connor's chart. If you have any questions, any comments about her chart, or about Saturn in Aquarius in general, please feel free to post below. Any comments? I always love to hear your comments and questions. And until next time.